This is a Geek Leader podcast, and I'm your host, John Rauda. This show is all about helping us grow as leaders, become better technologists, and improve our lives both at work and at home. I hope you enjoy the show and learn a lot. Hello, world, and welcome to a Geek Leader podcast. I'm your host, John Rauda. Today's sponsor is A2 Hosting. I've been using A2 Hosting solid state hosting solutions for our website at geekleader.com for many years now, and absolutely love their support, their service, and all the features that you get. You get access to cPanel. You get all of the things that you can imagine for a great WordPress experience, including their A2 optimized WordPress, which does extra security checks, extra lockdown. You can lock down your editor file so you can't edit anything inside there. You get alerts whenever there are file changes that are done. You can also do automatic updates, backups, and more with A2 Hosting. So highly recommend it. Go to geekleader.com/A2 to get more information and to sign up for their solid state turbocharged speed hosting today. Again, that's at geekleader.com/A2. All right, Geek Leaders, today on the show, I am honored to have Dr. Victoria Grady, and she is the Associate Professor for Organizational Behavior Management and the Academic Director of the MSM Graduate Program at the School of Business for George Mason. She's also consultant for FORVIS, which is based out of Charlotte, the area that I'm from, and the author of a book that I'm holding right now in my hand called Stuck: How to Win at Work by Understanding Loss. Victoria, welcome to the show.
Thank you, John, so much for having me be a part of your show. I'm honored to be here and share the next little bit with you and your audience.
If you don't mind, just tell the audience a little bit about how you got to where you are today in your career and kind of what is it exactly that you do.
Thanks so much for that, John. So that's a fun story. I started out with an undergrad in accounting. And interestingly, as I got into accounting, I recognized that what it was about accounting that I was really interested in had more to do with the behavioral side of the people inside of accounting rather than specifically the audit or tax space. And so I went back to grad school and got a master's degree in management, and then spent some time abroad and recognized that I wanted to continue teaching, but if I was going to come back to the United States and do that here in the higher ed space, that I needed to get a PhD. So I came back to the US and did that, and got a PhD and started teaching, and thought in 2006 that's where I would stay for my career. And the interesting thing about that, John, is that I found that while I love teaching, I couldn't practically apply the theory the way that my students needed me to. And so I decided in 2009 to start a business, a consulting business. And I started out super small with just clients in the healthcare space. And it grew to the position that you mentioned with FORVIS, that is more, it's actually a professor in residence. So I work with their healthcare people and change team to define new ways or new perspectives on how to think about change inside of organizations. And wow, John, that is for me at least been a perfect match, right? So that I have the academic and theoretical background, but now I have a live laboratory, if you will, to practice and apply and watch, how some of the theory is actually impacting the workplace. And I think that's maybe one of my most favorite parts, as it turns out, about my role in academia, is the ability to apply what we talk about in theory. So
so I like to talk to my team. I tell them sometimes that they're my lab where I get to practice things and see what's working and what's not working, and share some of those lessons that I've learned. Whether it's at a conference when I'm speaking or on the show, anything like that, where I can say, hey, I did this with my team and it worked out really well, or I did this and it kind of sucked. And here's why. Here's what I learned from it. So what are some examples of things that you've learned that you can share that have been really cool breakthrough lessons that you've done in your quote lab and been able to share with your students?
So I think that's a really interesting question. So if you look at the literature around org change, which is my research area and my interest, the real concentration of literature was started being published in the early 1990s. I mean, there were things before that. Of course, we have Kurt Lewin's work back in the 50s, but there wasn't really an abundance of literature in that space until the early 90s. And what I noted is that from a theoretical perspective, they're very similar, right? There's a lot of things, like, for example, in Cotter, that have similarities with other authors in that space. For example, Daryl Connor, or maybe the work of Bridges. They're unique. Each perspective or model around change management or change theory is unique, but there are a lot of commonalities. And so to me, one of the most significant things that I've taken away from the practical application is that there is no cookie cutter model that works for everybody, right? It doesn't matter how flexible a formula you create. There are always variances in that, or variables in that formula, because you're dealing with people, right? And you have individuals and individual behavior. And so you really need to take a careful custom, and I'm quoting in the air, custom look to really be able to integrate a change strategy that works for that unique organization. And I think that's probably my biggest takeaway. And I'm teaching an MBA class right now, and we are talking about that every week. So we present new models, and I say, but remember, I'm not telling you that this model is going to work for your organization. It may be that one piece of this model actually works for your organization. You have to look at the big picture of the different models and formulas, again, quoting in the air, formulas out there, and decide what works best for your team. What do you need to do in terms of the uniqueness of your culture? How do you create a change strategy that works for the organization as a whole and for your team individually? So I think that's probably my biggest takeaway, is the recognition that it isn't about one format or one approach. It's about looking at the different approaches and being able to put together that custom strategy that really works for your unique organization. Does that make sense, John?
Yeah, it does. And that's exactly why I kind of started this show and went down this path of, leadership for technologists, because I found that a lot of things were different when it came to tech. I'd go through my management training or leadership training that they would do at a company level. And a lot of the things that they talked about didn't apply to the personalities that I managed. We have stereotypical technical geeks that are out there that are, some of us are introverted, some of us are quiet. We like video games. We're a different breed of people sometimes. But you also have, right now I have a very diverse team. I have some folks that are super happy morning people. They want to tell everybody good morning and chat a bunch. And we have other people that want to come into their office, shut the door, and never see another human for the rest of the day, or at least until they get a couple cups of coffee in them. So you have to adjust for each one of those. And I like to call it like, you take the whole fish, but you eat the meat and leave the bones. You're going to take the parts that apply for each person and each group, and you use that parts of it, and the rest of it you just leave behind.
I think that is amazing. And I think that from a practical application, John, that's exactly what I'm talking about. And I like the fish analogy. I can visualize it just as you said it. So I think that's super interesting. And it's so fun that you mentioned the technology space, and that's the part of the organization that you're specifically focused on and working with. I had a great opportunity to speak at a conference with a super interesting organization out of Canada called the Pink Elephant a few years ago. And I remember we were talking about some change theory. And one of the folks in the audience who Pink Elephant is definitely a technology-based organization. And one of the folks in the audience said, but in technology, everything's moving so fast. We don't have time, to dig down and really, figure out a custom approach. We just need something that we can put on top of our organization. And I said, as much as I appreciate that, and you're right, technology is moving really fast. And John, this was, 8 years ago. So I mean, to me, the pace of change is even, multiplied, now. But I said to the guy in the audience, I don't think you have time not to do this. I actually think that it's more important to make sure that you're implementing change and implementing strategy inside your organization and taking into account the nuances, rather than just doing it fast or doing it quickly or doing it what you perceive to be in an efficient way, because maybe that's not going to end up being so efficient if you don't have your team coming along with the change. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And it, when I look, it reminded me of a quote that I read in your book. I highlighted a few things that I wanted to talk about. One of them was a quote right at chapter 4, where it says, "Every human is like all other humans, some other humans, and no other human." And I think that last part is the part that you really got to focus on, is that everybody's a little bit different. And if you don't have that customer approach, you're going to get kind of what we see right now with this great resignation. We got a lot of people leaving because some companies aren't customizing the way that they approach business and organizational change for everybody. And I think that that's one of the nuances that we kind of have to focus on as leaders. That even if our company can't do it, how can we as individual bosses or managers or team leads approach each individual person in a unique way? And I think having one-on-ones is kind of one of the ways to learn about those people and do that and figure out how to apply those unique principles for each individual.
Yes, no, I totally agree. And that's fun that particular quote resonated with you. I think it's interesting to me from an individual perspective, the different areas of the book that resonate with resonate. Yeah, is that the right word?
I think that is. Resonate.
Resonate. There we go. Resonate. You said the great resignation, so my brain was thinking around that too. Anyway, thanks for that, John. So resonate with different people, because it's fun, right, to have these conversations and to hear what really helps you understand more about the purpose of the book. And so I love it that you shared that. So thanks for that.
So one of the things you talk about it a little bit is how organizations get stuck and cultures can get stuck within that organization. And I feel like we've seen a lot of that recently, especially post-pandemic or during the pandemic, even, where some cultures and companies have shifted to one way or the other, or there's been some extremes, and other groups have just seemed stuck. How is it that cultures get stuck?
I think that's such an interesting question. So I think that the way that organizations, let me start there, John, get stuck is based on our connection to or reliance on those things that help us feel secure. Right. And so we get used to, we have a certain way of doing things, or we have a habit that is formed that really, kind of drives how the organization works. And there's no better example than the pandemic, and the way the pandemic turned all of those things that quite frankly, the entire globe, in terms of workplaces, relied on things upside down. And so we have had to kind of rethink how we do business. And interestingly, you're exactly right. There's a lot of organizations who made the pivot during the pandemic and are now trying to pivot backwards, right? And that doesn't work. I mean, people, you have to stop there and say, okay, so our culture pre-pandemic looked like X. Our culture during the pandemic maybe looked like Y, but coming out and going forward, maybe it's actually going to look more like Z. And so we're going to have to, reformulate what that culture looks like. And I think that if we get stuck and trying to go back to the X and we, wanting to be back where we were, then I think that's how we get stuck, right? That's how the organization, it can't move forward, because everything in the environment has changed. And if you're going to keep up with the moving environment, then you've got to be able to move it forward. And so being aware of our instinctual predisposition to be stuck, right? What we talk about early on in the book around memory, emotion, and learning, and the role that our brain plays in memory, emotion, and learning, and making sure that we are acutely aware of the need to move those three things forward and to provide a secure environment for our employees, no matter if they're remote, if they're hybrid, or if they're all back in the office, to do that. And permission in some cases, John, to do that, because some employees don't really know what that new space or that new culture, that new way of thinking is going to look like inside the organization. So there's a lot of leading that needs to take place as we move forward. Does that resonate or make sense?
Yeah, it does. And going back to that, let's unpack that a little bit when it comes to, what as a leader should we, like right now, if we don't even know what the culture is going to end up like still, we don't know what Z is. You talked about that. So how do we as leaders navigate that and, reassure our team that things are going to be okay here? And how do we manage that with each individual person? Because like you're looking at hybrid workplaces now, some people love coming back to the office, because they want to get away from a noisy apartment or whatever they're from, that they don't have a good work environment at home. They come into an office, or maybe they just love that personal connection and seeing people face to face and talking with them. But then they come back to an office that's empty because half their employees are at home, or more than half are remote. And you have to deal with that kind of, some people that want to be at home because they're more productive there. They don't have a commute. They get more time with their family or whatever. And other people that want to be in the office because they want the interaction, but they're missing that because the other people aren't there.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's interesting because we talked about in a recent article, John, kind of a 3-step process to consider in terms of helping your brain move forward, right? All of the change that we're talking about is fundamentally rooted in the literature around neuroscience, right? And the neuroscience literature is actually talking about components of the way our brain works that are biological, instinctual, right? You can't make that go away. Fortunately or unfortunately, we're stuck with that process inside of our brains. So by recognizing the memory, emotion, and learning that is at the forefront, and talking openly about the what I refer to as beneath the surface challenges, like what you just mentioned. There may be people inside of organizations who choose to work hybrid, and there may be people who choose to be totally remote. But as those hybrid employees come back, they're going to experience that workspace differently than they did before, for the reasons that you mentioned, because it may feel empty, or it may be that they feel a little angst, right, about being in that workplace, because some organizations are coming back more completely, and it feels different than it did before, because you are now back in an environment where maybe you could get COVID, but recognizing that we've been vaccinated and boosted, and we're hopefully going to be okay, but there's still that angst that's there, and the recognition of the differences in the way people feel. That's where we say start, right? And then number 2, acknowledge the uncertainty. So this may not stay like this indefinitely. We may be in a movement period right here. Things may be getting adjusted as we move forward, and they may not settle for a little while, because it may take all of us, all the employees, the leaders in the organization, and the clients and the customers of the organization. It may take us all a bit of time to figure out what's really going to work going forward. So that is to say that there is uncertainty that's going to exist for a bit, and we need to manage through that, right? And then in the end, we say that you have to reestablish your memory, emotion, and learning. You have to reestablish the culture. You have to reestablish what's going to work for this organization going forward, and how do we support the employees to maximize their potential in the organization, because that's ultimately what we all are striving to do, right, John?
Yeah, definitely.
So that's what I would say.
When it comes to like making sure that people are heard, what's a good way, like a practical tip that leaders can do to make sure that their people feel heard? Because sometimes you listen, but the person's like, I just feel like I'm not being heard because you're not doing what I'm asking. You're like, well, because what you're asking is stupid. I'm listening to it, I hear you, but I can't do that. I can't give you unlimited vacation because our company doesn't have that policy. And me as a leader, I can't just do it, So how is
Mhm.
it that we as leaders can maybe practically listen to people and let them know that they're being heard, but we can't comply with what they're asking for?
Mhm. So I think that that's really
And I'm sorry, and one more thing, and do it in a nice way without saying that your idea is stupid, because I know that's not the right thing. That's just what I think in my head.
That's so funny. Yeah, no, it's really interesting that you say that. I have all kinds of examples that are going through my head. So one example that comes to mind is in a healthcare organization, we have two distinctly different groups of people. And those two distinctly different groups of people are the clinical folks and the folks who are, have to be present, right, in the healthcare organization on a daily basis. Your doctors and nurses and clinicians and lab individuals and people in that space, right? And then you have perhaps your HR team or your finance team or the insurance collecting team. I'm just throwing out different areas of
Mhm.
healthcare that might have the flexibility to stay remote. And so it's interesting because I've heard some employees say, hey, how do I get a remote environment on the clinical side? And that's a really challenging space, right? And so instead of being able to accommodate that, because you can't there are definitely, televisits and things that are possible, but there's limitations, right? Especially in a hospital environment, there are limitations to that. So one healthcare system that we did a project with decided, you know what, we're going to bring our folks who don't necessarily have to be there on a regular basis. We're going to bring them back 2 or 3 days a week. And then everybody kind of feels equally treated, right?
Mhm.
And so while that wasn't addressing what the clinicians ask is how can we work remotely, because that wasn't possible, we figured out a way to bring the other folks back, or the organization did, not me, but the organization did. And that kind of satisfied the questions and the perception of inequality that existed inside of that organization. And I thought that was a very interesting way to handle that. Another thing, John, that comes to my brain that I love talking about this, to be perfectly honest with you, is assessments or surveys. Now, I know you
Okay.
probably, I can't see your face, so I don't know if you rolled your eyes or not, but maybe you did, because a lot of people do when you say that. But surveys or assessments are a really good way to get people to share information with you. The problem with them is a lot of times we as leaders and managers and supervisors inside organizations take that information and we file it away, literally, or or literally file it away, or even file it away perception wise, right?
Mhm.
So we shouldn't do that. And there's lots of really good literature that goes back to the 1920s. And a group of researchers from Harvard said, if you're going to ask people for their opinion or ask them for feedback or ask them for input, you got to figure out a way to make sure they feel heard. And let me wrap that back to that hospital example that I just mentioned. That's how they knew. They put out an assessment and they knew that there were some challenges in terms of inequalities going on beneath the surface that were not recognized overtly within the organization. They collected the information and they acted on it. You have to act on it, right? And they needed to act on it so that the entire organization, and I'm quoting in the air again, John, felt heard, right? They felt like the feedback and the input they had provided to the leadership team was listened to, and they could see it actually being acted on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Um, but sometimes you can't act, Uh, uh,
Mhm.
I guess when you can't act, you just need to talk
Mhm.
and
I think
and
you're right. I think
communicate.
communication. Yeah, I think it becomes
Yeah.
really, really important. And like the hospital system couldn't do what the clinicians wanted. They did it in a different way. I
Right. They
think
still did something, right?
yes, that's it, John. You got to do something that says,
Mhm.
hey, ladies and gentlemen, I heard you. but we can't do what you ask. I can't give you unlimited vacation because that's just not the way this organization works. However, we can give you, an additional few days of personal leave. That personal leave can be used for whatever you want it to, or, we can allow you to work flex time. Like a lot of, I mentioned earlier, I live in the Washington, D.C. area, and a lot of the government organizations have embraced or government agencies have embraced flex time, because that gives employees the ability to work 4 days and have a 3-day weekend. They're not going to give you a 3-day weekend or 4-day work week and eliminate 8 hours of the workday. But if you want to work 2 hours extra for 4 days in a row and then have a 3-day work week, a 3-day weekend, you can totally do that. So while they weren't willing to go to a 32-hour work week, they definitely have been willing to say, okay, but if you can do 10 hours, 10 hours, 10 hours and do 40 hours in the 4 days, Monday through Thursday, then go for it and do that. And of course, John, that's not in all agencies. That's just in some, but it's really, that's an interesting way to hear your employees. Another example. Do you think that resonates?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great example of how you can, you can't give them what they're asking for, but you can show them that you're doing something, that you're, hearing them, and yeah, I can't meet you all the way, but I can go, a couple of steps in your direction and let you know that you're being heard. We care about you. We respect you. We just can't give you everything right now.
And that's huge, John. I really think that is an important part of the Great Resignation, right? And I got to do a lecture series for a couple of different associations this spring around the Great Resignation. And I'll tell you what, that I really think that there are several different facets, and that's one of them. Employees not feeling heard and just exasperated, right? I'm out because I've been telling you what I need, and there's no movement, to help me kind of figure out, okay, I can't have exactly what it is that I'm asking for, but maybe some variation of that that would still help me feel like you care about the way that the organization is impacting, my day-to-day life. So yeah, I think that's a great point, John.
Yeah, I think there's also, when you go back to that Great Resignation, it's something we've talked about, probably ad nauseum on the show in the past. But one of the things that I've noticed is that there's a lot of thoughts that the grass is greener on the other side. And I don't know if that's because it really is, or if it's because that leaders aren't doing a very good job of communicating where their company's going or what they have, or maybe they just don't know. But I talked to several people that have, changed positions and jobs in the last, 18 months. And some of them are like, yeah, it's awesome here. And other ones are like, maybe I made a mistake. Maybe this unlimited PTO thing isn't what I thought it was, or maybe this, work from home thing isn't as easy as it was when I'd already built relationships before I moved home. And now I have to build them completely remote. And it's a lot harder, than I thought it would be. And I think there's a lot of that going on too.
I think that's huge, right? I think that's huge. And I think you're absolutely spot on. And I think that's really interesting that you've had the opportunity to hear that, from other folks that you've been communicating with, because I think that is really interesting. I mean, I have some folks in my sphere that have very similar experiences, right, to what you just noted. And I think it's really interesting, and especially among some of my MBA students who are doing exactly what you just said, maybe even finishing their MBA and thinking, oh, I'm moving now, I'm going to a different company and it's going to be so awesome. But there are definitely nuances to making that change. And for whatever reason, right? Because you want a hybrid work environment, a totally remote, or you want to do something different with your life, you want to go in a different direction. I think that it's really interesting. The whole grass is always greener.
Yeah. Because I know, like for me, I've talked to people like, oh man, when we were, at lockdown, it was so great working from home. I want to be remote. And then, I've talked to some people and they said, well, when I got there, I didn't realize how hard it was to build relationships, because I don't want to be that weirdo that just messages someone just to talk, I don't want to like Zoom you just to, hey, how you doing? But how else do you build that relationship when you don't really have any work to do with the person at the time, but you know you're going to need to build those team relationships? Whereas I can just walk by the hall and see someone and stop in and say hello, we'll have this conversation, we'll get to know each other and kind of become work friends. Whereas when you're 100% remote, you lose that ability. It becomes a lot harder to kind of make intentional efforts to do that. And I think some people have kind of missed the mark on what that really means.
I think that's interesting. And I think that, I mean, that goes back to the three things that I mentioned earlier that I think are really important for leaders to think about, as they move forward. Because I think if you take a moment and remind your employees, kind of that that there are things going on beneath the surface. That we are in an uncertain environment, right? And you recognize the need to reestablish what the culture is going to look like going forward. I really think that level of communication and that level of dialogue, if you will, so it's not just communication, especially not one way, right? It's truly opening that dialogue with your employees. You can hopefully, get in front of some of the fleeting, I'll call them, desires to look at other organizations or to resign or to do other things, because you're acknowledging that we're all in the same space and we'll get through this together. And a lot of times that collaborative, supportive feeling of working through something together is all an employee needs to stay engaged, right?
Yeah, definitely. So when it comes to engagement, do you see that as being kind of one of the biggest things that makes organizations get stuck?
Engagement is a weird thing, John. And if you had asked me about that 2 years ago, I would have answered this question totally different. But over the course of the last couple of years, I think the literature around engagement has highlighted some really interesting things. One of those, to me personally, is a study that came out of one of the Yale laboratories around engaged employees who are severely burned out, right? And so what their research showed is that 20% of your most engaged or highest engaged employees, 20% of them are burned out, done, right?
Wow.
So they're engaged, and those people are also some of the highest performers inside the organization, right? So when you have high performers who are, testing out or assessing out, if you're doing a survey or a qualitative or quantitative assessment to understand who's engaged, and to recognize that if you're looking at engagement and you're thinking, oh, great, so we're awesome, we're good to go, but ignoring the potential that 20% of those highest engaged, high performing employees are actually your most burned out employees, I think that's significant, right?
Yeah.
And I think from an engagement standpoint, understanding what engaged looks like and what is healthy for the individuals inside your organization is, in my opinion, a really important part of not getting stuck, right? Because I think that if you've got employees who are your high performers and they're burned out, those folks are stuck too. Even though they may be performing, they're stuck. And I think that's a really important component of this literature and of the work we did in the research around stuck, and really understanding what the implications of that is on the overall performance and the culture of the organization. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So what's the best way to fix it?
Well, I think the best way to fix it is the first step is to recognize it, right? Is the awareness of it. So there's this really fun YouTube video out there, and it's called the awareness test. And all the listeners out there can go to YouTube and they can search for the awareness test. And I think it's 1 minute and 13 seconds. And it's really funny. And it's watching and counting basketball passes, but you're really not watching basketball passes. You're really watching as you're noticing that something else happens. And I think it's really interesting how many people are not aware of these little steps that you can take, like acknowledging the fact that your most engaged employees may be also your most burned out employees, or acknowledging the fact that you may have people inside your organization who are developing a feeling of inequality because some groups can totally stay remote and other groups inside the organization can have to be there no matter what. I mean, I think you have to have an awareness of these challenges that are nuances to the organization and to the different groups and departments and areas of employees inside your organization, to really keep your organization from not getting stuck.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. So how can people, learn more about Stuck, your book, and connect with you online, and maybe learn more about some of the things you do, and figure out how they can either prevent their company from getting stuck or get unstuck if they already are?
Yeah. So that's a great question. Thanks for asking that, John. So I would encourage your listeners. It's Victoria Grady, Grad as in Delta Y. Again, George Mason professor. That's what you can look for on LinkedIn. But if you just connect with me on LinkedIn and then message me, I'm happy to share some of the articles that we've written that have come or are related to Stuck. But you can also get a copy of the book or an electronic version of the book on Amazon. It's a great place to start, or just have a conversation with me. Not worry about reading articles or reading the book, but just have a conversation. I mean, our mission is to help organizations get unstuck. That's the purpose of writing this book, right? Is to get to work with organizations or chat with people and be able to share the science. I think that's, to me, the most important part of this is sharing the science. So however your listeners would like to do that, either via connecting with me on LinkedIn, buying a copy of the book, or connecting and then asking me to share articles, any of those are great ways to do that.
Awesome. And I'll link that up in the show notes at geekleader.com so they can get a copy of the book there and connect with you. I'll put your LinkedIn in there as well so they can message you and all that good stuff. So Victoria, thanks for coming on the show. I really appreciate talking with you today.
Yeah, it was really fun, John. Thanks so much for inviting me. I really had a great time.
If you enjoyed that episode, please leave a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. I'd greatly appreciate that. And also, don't forget to check out merch. We have some t-shirts that I've designed that are on at geekleader.com. You can click on the merchandise section there and check that out. And also, don't forget about the books from our guests. So if you like this guest and other guests that have written books, please go ahead and check that out at geekleader.com. I would greatly appreciate it, and I'm sure they would too.